So, we are now recording. Welcome everyone to this webcast. I like to run these every once in a while, especially based on the amount that I talk to customers, which could be anywhere from, 6 to 10 or more a week. I feel that there is sometimes a systemic either action or lack of action, or knowledge or lack of knowledge that I feel is going out there in the marketplace. And one of those areas that I feel that sometimes people get, they're so busy in their day-to-day is around, even once you've upgraded to Informix, what are all the things that are in there? There's certain pieces of technology that that certain people were motivated by, but there's a whole lot of other things that they may have forgotten about. So, these are kind of my monikers to me, what defines Informix and what makes it so successsul. And for those of you who are on this chat today who have not met me or had a conversation with me, my name is Tom Rieger. I am let's call it the brand leader for Informix. I cover the western part of the U.S. and Canada. I do have a peer who covers the eastern part of the U.S. in the federal market space, since the federal government is the single largest consumer of really anything in the world. One of the things I bring to bear here is the fact that I've been around Informix for 24 years. Back when I think I worked for a company where the only department in the organization that wasn't on the mainframe was mine. So, I was with Informix for 7 years and feel a great amount of admiration for both the technology, the customers, and how I see it truly make a difference for customers today, even in 2012. And as I look at these always references that I have going on here, I still think it's interesting how, as someone who's been around open systems technology for 25 years, why in 2012 are all the other databases such a pain in the behind? And I think, when we're all done here, there'll be certain sound bites that even for some of the more seasoned customers who are on this chat will pick up on. So, to me, there's also two types of new that I wanted to highlight today in terms of reasons to migrate and upgrade and things to consider is, within the version 11.70 that's now been out for, I think, 22 months, we're now on FC5 is the fifth fixed pack of it. FC6 will be coming out next month. There's over 135 new primary features amongst these 5 fixed packs. A lot of new stuff. And oh, by the way, if you really read into it, some of these new features are actually made up of 4 or 5 or 6 sub-features. So it's kind of like that ominous part of the movie Back to School where the professor tells Rodney Dangerfield, you only have one question for your final exam made of 50 subparts. Well, there's certain features here that are the same way. There's a lot of sub-features that make that up. So you literally have hundreds of new capabilities that are within and around the engine to make it that much more autonomic, perform, and just be this always-on database that we love so dearly. But then there's also these extensions that are around the database and in the database to enhance it as well. Rather, it's the fact that for those of you who may or may not know, but once you load 1170 FC1 or above, a lot of the let's call them database extensions, they used to be called data blades, are now part of the engine. So you now, without knowing it or not, gain that capability to manage those new data types. And I'll talk about that a little bit, because it may or may not be something that is in your area of requirements. And then there's also add-ons. Compression has been around in Informix for a couple of years, and then this warehouse accelerator. And then I want to talk about migrating. Because, again, as I talk to customers, it's interesting how we've become almost kind of like Pavlov's dog when it comes to upgrades. In fact, I was talking to a client yesterday, a large bank, where they talked about when they went through kind of a whole stack upgrade of their Microsoft platform, the operating system, the SQL Server database. And it was like 5 people in 90 days to actually do the upgrade, and it still wasn't working right. And I think to myself, I know customers who do upgrades, and it's kind of like their lunchtime thing to just go do without any problems with Informix. So I want to talk about upgrades and migrations a little bit as well here in this presentation. So I made this slide like this on purpose. I would like to think that no one is squinting at this because I know my eyes don't do it well. Even when I copy and paste these in here, I knew I was probably going to cause a trouble. But the reason I did this is because if I look at all the new capabilities between, XC1 all the way up to XC5, every release has had an incremental number of net new features in it. And the reason I mention this is, if for no other reason, as a proof point to show that there is an extensive amount of development still going on around Informix. And I created this short bit.ly link if you want to go see what's new in 1170 with, kind of a paragraph description or more of each one of the 135 new features I described. Go ahead and not go blind, because sadly, even as I wear contact lenses, I have to wear cheaters now. Go to this web link, and it should take you right to all the new stuff in 1170. But there are some I want to highlight. In fact, especially I saw in one of the questions I remember asking on the reg page before anybody came online here was around what version are you running? And there are a fair number of you that are, already kind of on 11.x or even 1170. But I wanted to highlight some of those incremental features. In fact, let me go back to that make up some of these other versions as well. So you can see that even if you are, let's say, on FC1, for instance, and there are some things you're possibly looking for, you can go find those in later releases because, again, each one of these dot releases have new features. Now, one of the things as an old Informix guy that I always said when I worked for Informix in the 90s to any new customer is the first thing you do when you load the new version is read the release notes, and read the release notes, please. Because, within those release notes, you'll discover all of the things that you are gaining with that. So, please make sure you do that. So, when it comes to autonomics, and interesting enough, I gave a presentation here a few months back where I actually went to Wikipedia or the internet to really get that definition of what autonomics is. And it's actually a term that was coined by IBM around automated computing, making it to where the technology is more of a black box. When I think about a black box, I think about how they are self-installable, self-configurable, self-maintainable, and self-healing. And in fact, almost in that order, because you take it in that order, you've got to load it before you configure it, before you maintain it, before you just make sure it runs on its own as a self-healing technology. And Informix has always been known as being a very, very autonomic database. In fact, I would challenge that today it is the most autonomic technology that anyone will run. I have customers who, as I think about a very large retail customer, they have 18,000 machines and 2 DBAs running these 18,000 machines. And they told me, in fact, at a meeting, we have more people worrying about our phone systems and keeping those running than we do our Informix databases. Or I have another, a mid-tier entity with 150 storefronts where they have 160 Informix machines and 1/10 of a person worrying about those, but yet they have another database technology where they have 3 full-time people babysitting that one box. So it's adding to these things that I think, at least in 2012, is pretty much ubiquitous in defining what Informix is. But as you get into 1170, there's a lot of new capabilities. In fact, I highlighted all kind of the automatic or automated kind of verbs here around the things you can do now with Informix that before you were more challenged. So it gives you fewer reasons to have to bring the machine down to make a change to the machine. And I'll get into these a little bit more. And then, of course, I would bet that almost all of us have a pretty good understanding of the different replications. I know HDR has been part of the engine since 7.10.UC1 when it came out in 1995. Kind of scary, I know that date so well. And then as it's evolved, where HDR is synchronous, you can have asynchronous with RSS if you have a slower network or the network's the problem. You can have a shared disk. You also have kind of the evolution of what used to be called continuous data replication, which is now more enterprise replication, and to have it be not just replicating the data, but even replicating any changes in the data definitions, create, drop, alter, types of actions across a heterogeneous hardware set. And most importantly, these can all be used, with each other. So it's more of an and conversation versus an or conversation. So you can do HDR and RSS and enterprise replication. And oh, by the way, you can do it in a very secure format. So these days, as we're dealing with kind of the fear and paranoia of hacking and computing, there's a need to not just worry about your data at rest in your data center, but even across the wire, your ability to replicate it in a very encrypted format. And then there's this ominous thing called the cloud. In fact, I'm sure if I asked each of you what you thought the cloud was, I would bet I would get completely different answers from everyone. So, you now have this ability to even do things like do an on-tape command into the cloud encrypted. But then there's also these enabling tools. One of these that I find I consistently tell customers exists out there because it's this little hidden jewel that a lot of people don't realize exists, is the connection manager. The connection manager is this tool that sits on top of Informix, that sits above it on a different machine to route users between Informix instances. So if you have a primary, a secondary, and you want to go from having a manual failover to an automatic failover environment, you can use the connection manager for this. Or if you want to make it to where now with the latest versions of Informix, that secondary box can be fully update. You can do a full cluster where that secondary box isn't necessarily a primary and a secondary as much as it is you have two machines that are keeping each other up to date. You maybe want to send certain users over to one machine versus another, and if there's a failover, to move them to the running box. And then I know there was just a lab chat earlier this morning on IFX Clone, which, I don't know about you, but is a feature I remember asking for years ago around how do I take an instance of my database and copy it really easily. That was never easy. And then I also have vivid memories of, and I'm sure some of you on this call will remember, all the different administrative strategies that Informix and IBM has had over the years around having this GUI tool to make it to where your telnet screen is not your administration tool. Well, I can tell you, the Open Admin tool is probably the most defined, the most maintained, and the best admin tool I've seen going yet. As a matter of fact, as the Open Admin tool or as the database is, either there's a bug that is fixed or there's a new feature that's put in the database, the Open Admin tool is part of the engineering cycle. So whenever anything new happens in the engine, that is enabled within the Open Admin tool. I like pictures. If all I did was presented PowerPoints with bullets, someone please tell me, and I promise I'll never do it again. This is a picture of a network topology of a customer of mine up in the Pacific Northwest. And the reason I show this, and if you can go full screen, you can probably see it better, but this really is a mix of HDR and RSS in connection managers. In fact, they have fault-tolerant connection managers so they can make sure they never have a single point of failure within their Informix infrastructure, because this is maintaining a system that if it goes offline, they stop business. Period. It's processing millions and millions of transactions a day. So if this stopped, they would stop. So that's replication. Now, I think about some other interesting capabilities in 1170 that were in the FC1 release or XC1 release that have also been evolving as 1170 now moves into the XC6 release later this year, is around storage management. And to really make that be one of the areas you don't have to worry about anymore. How many of us have had to figure out how to deal with too many extents on a table? Painful. Oh, that for some reason, some contractor came in here and created a table, loaded up millions of rows, and they used the default and next extent size in how they created that data, and then they went away, and no one noticed for years. And now you have hundreds of extents on a database table, very fragmented table. Well, with 1170, you can now do things like not just defragging of the extents online, but also compaction of those data pages, as for instance, data changes within that data table, and even making to where you compact and bring back some of those data pages into being usable by the database itself. So these are all tools that have been enabled for you to use. It's also usable with raw and cooked devices. So, and in fact, I've seen customers over the years, and I'm sure some of you would cringe and say you've seen this. You see where, because you have a turnover in database administrators or people who are allowed to touch the machine, that you have a mix of raw and cooked devices for an instance of Informix. I'm not here to judge, but let's just say, I hope that when they do a hardware migration or SAN migration, they fix that. So, with this, you now do not have to worry about the disk itself. You also have, and I mentioned on this particular slide, the ability to also automatically add space to chunks on an as-need basis if you get near a certain threshold. So, for instance, if you have a DB space that's getting a certain percentage full, let's say 95% full, and you need to go and increase the size of a chunk or the number of chunks on a DB space, you can set that up once, and it will run for you until that pool of storage that you defined is used up. So what is the beauty of these last couple of slides I presented? You can now make sure you don't run out of space anymore, and you can now make sure that the administrative overhead of worrying about the fragmentation and the use of that space is now automated as well. So I've described all this, and it's also part of the OAT tool as well. As a matter of fact, you can see here where even within the OAT tool, it makes it really easy to find those tables with bad extents and to defrag them, compress them, do whatever you want to do to those tables through the Open Admin tool. And in fact, you see here on this screen, for those of you who have not played with OAT, you can go in here and choose tables and set up which ones you want to repack, shrink, defrag extents on, and make it to where it is all a very simple click-click process. Now, I'll be the first to say, I, as an old Unix guy, still think Telnet is the best admin tool that ever existed. But OAT does have certain clickable administrative processes built into it that do make it easier to figure this stuff out than going in and running an on-stack command or a sysmaster query. So I do want to highlight that as well. And then you can even set up things like policies. So for some reason the table gets to a certain number of rows, compress it. You want to repack, you want to shrink, you want to defrag. Hopefully you can see these things. Again, my reference pointer on glasses I made earlier, I wasn't kidding. But you can see references here where you can set it up, when you want it done, what day of the week you want it done, set up that policy, and it's all ready to go. When I also think about within the database, there's only certain things you can really do now with indexing strategies to make Informix better and the optimizer. I would still challenge that Informix is the best cost-based optimizer in the marketplace, period. I mean, I'm sure it is rare some of you on the phone have ever had to use any of the hints that were engineered into Informix years back, because as long as your statistics are accurate or even pretty accurate, you will get the right query plan. There's also some new indexes within 1170 that I want to highlight. One of these is the multi-index scan. So you can now have multiple columns within an index and have it be taken advantage of by that one index versus having two indexes against it. I see this being of great value, especially where you want to minimize that overhead of index maintenance, so you don't have a bunch of indexes on a table that's having a lot of transactions against it, or it's a really big table, and indexes consume probably more disk space than the data does itself. So here's one of the ways in which you can create one index instead of multiple indexes to solve a query problem, performance problem. And for those of you on the phone, I still love the visualization of a query plan. You know, it's one thing to look at a SQL explain output and figure out what's going on, but to be able to have it be pictorial, to me, speaks in volumes. I still think the best GUI tool Informix ever had back in the day was OnPerf. For those of you who remember OnPerf, you know, in a motif or X environment, and you ran a big query, and it would create something that looked a lot like what's in OAT right here, and it would automatically throttle up that tachometer in each one of the iterators to show you how much is going through there. I personally thought that was the best GUI demo of Informix you could ever have. Well, here's the next best thing in a browser around seeing how you can take advantage of this multi-index scan within the query tree tool of OAT. And another indexing strategy that's new in 1170 that you may or may not realize is this thing called Forest of Trees Index. And my apologies, there's one R in forest, not two, so I'll have to give John Miller trouble for that because this is his slide for those you know John. But if you have an index that is heavily used, let's say one of your top 5 indexes, I would bet that that root node on that index is getting absolutely hammered. So what you have is a contention with your index within that index page, even within memory. Where with a forest for trees, you actually take an index and take that root node off and create almost like a fragmented sub-indexes within buckets. So if you have an instance where you are running into, in a very heavily used transaction environment, an index that is becoming actually a bottleneck and not a solution, consider the forest of trees index. Nothing makes me crazier than a customer who thinks they're running update stats right, and then they complain about the optimizer. Well, within 1170, you now have it to where you can set it where update stats just automatically runs. And it uses the typical high, medium, low that is kind of best practices that engineering has discovered over the years to capture statistics for the optimizer and puts those within the database library. So auto update stats is, to me, one of the best new features that I think we could ever ask for in the database. It wasn't painful for them to engineer into the product, but it's in there now for you to consider using. I think this is a point where I may want to call out, too, that, as you're playing with 1170, don't think that you want to continue bringing forward your onconfig files. Make sure you map those onconfig parameters into a newer onconfig file so you don't lose out on some of these capabilities that are in here, like the auto state mode being set to 1 or 0. Please make sure you review these onconfig files. So again, as you're reading the release notes, look at that onconfig file and map those to the release notes to see what's new for you to play with. And again, like I said, there's OAT. And OAT isn't just a browser-based admin tool that is there for you to look at stuff that is really just a pretty version of OnStat output, because I've seen those over the years. They drive me crazy. They do give you a much more pictorial and clickable view and also administration of the database like never before. I want to highlight, too, I've sometimes had customers tell me, I downloaded OAT about a year and a half ago, and I wasn't impressed. Well, you know what? Go get it again, because as they come out with every release of the database, a new release of OAT comes out with bug fixes, new features, and so on. And you'll even see within the what's new in 1170 a lot of references to new stuff that's in OAT to enable the capabilities of the database better. Here, to me, and this is something that is part of the XC4 release of OAT, is the Health Check plugin. Now, it's great to have an admin tool that kind of is almost like just the dashboard of how what my engine looks like. But to me, where the real secret sauce can come into play is if this administration tool actually kind of advises me on my pulse and my blood pressure and if I've ate too much salt. Where in this case, it does all these different lists of things here for you, and it's being evolved with every release as well. And it is an accumulation of knowledge that's come from tech support cases and scripts that engineering has created in our professional services organization to help automate a health check for your databases. So when you go download OAT, or as it is part of the Client SDK now, make sure you have the Health Check plugin or the Health Advisor plugin to go get it as well. And I do want to highlight a few features that are kind of favorites of mine that I think are little things that people don't realize. And these are in no real particular order except as I was literally reading through the release notes, is for those of you who may or may not know, in fact, I had one customer who, like, almost challenged me, to find an answer to this, is, for instance, you can now have SQL statements that are 4 gig in size. So if you're creating a store procedure or a really large table or something like that, you were limited to 64K forever and a day. In fact, until 1170 XC5, where now it's 4 gigs. The fetch buffer can now be up to 2 gigs in size. I think one of the interesting features that I'm actually in the middle of working with a customer around now is how they want to use an RSS secondary with the warehouse accelerator. So their primary system is a transactional system, 800 plus users managing one of the largest court systems in the nation, managing the court records, but this database goes back over 40 years. Well, on the secondary, they're running reports and queries and using some BI tools to run reports on the secondary server, and they're having a performance problem. By plugging in the warehouse accelerator, they're able to now take advantage of not just the secondary box, but to gain the acceleration they need to bring back these reports in a timely fashion, because some of these things literally are designed to where they have to kick them off on a Friday, and they're done when they come back on Monday. They want to be able to be a lot faster about that. Something else in XC5 is, for those of you who are playing with the warehouse accelerator, it now has trickle feed. Well, one of the challenges of the warehouse accelerator when it first came out was if you want the data changed, you had to literally drop and rebuild what you put in memory for the warehouse accelerator. Now you can change just a subset of the data based on data changes in your Informix database. Did everybody know that in XC4, with the on mode by this, I believe, WF command, you can change on the fly any on config parameter that shared memory will read, and it will automatically will automatically change that parameter set? Or how about if for some reason, even when you're running update stats, it takes forever? Well, one of the things you could do now is run update stats, and it'll do a sampling not just against the data, but against the index as well. So if you run update stats low against an index, it will do a sampling versus a full review of that index to gather its statistics. Automatic read ahead. And then especially, and I would like to hope that the average customer, and I know all of you are not average, you're all exceptional, but the average customer today shouldn't have too much of a memory limitation on their box. But maybe because of virtualization, and you're splitting, let's say, a box up for 50 different purposes, you're only able to allocate a certain amount of memory to Informix. You can make it to where the engine can be configured to prioritize what it does when it gets near kind of its shim total or what's available for it to address within that virtualized environment. This is something we especially did for people who are embedding Informix into kind of an appliance, whether it's a set-top box or something like that, where you have very specific low-cost, low-memory constraints. You can configure the database to where it will take a very small memory footprint approach towards running itself. Now, that to me is kind of what I would consider the highlights of a lot of the new stuff in 1170 across the five releases that have come out in the last 22 months, if I'm doing my math correctly. Along with one of the things that I want to highlight again is if for some reason you're getting into a situation where you need to do some interesting things with non-traditional data or use non-traditional functions against data, these data blades have been around some time, and they are evolving as well. The new spatial blade is taking advantage of the latest Esri libraries. The time series blade has been evolving every dot release over the last probably 4 or 5 years. And the text search is continually evolving as well and becoming more flexible. So I want to highlight that as well. But then there's also some of these additional capabilities as well that are either in the engine already or you can very easily go get. So one of these is storage optimization or compression. Now, I think it's interesting how I can go to Costco and buy, what, an 8-terabyte SAN for my home for $800. So storage in its own right has become almost free, cheap. But that delta between the performance of a processor and memory and the performance of that SAN has actually gapped out quite a bit. It has become very broad. That performance of that spindle has not kept up with Moore's law in terms of raw performance like processing power and memory speeds. So one of the things you gain with compression is also a gain in Informix performance because that disk is turning less. So whenever I've worked with a customer and they turn on compression for, let's say, a certain set of tables or something like that, they do see a performance gain. So you think in your back of your mind, well, my traditional perception of compression is that it will slow things down because of that act of compression and decompressing by the processor. But it isn't like zipping up a file on your hard drive. This is dictionary-based compression. So it is actually very, very fast in terms of what you gain in terms of performance, but you don't have that CPU-intensive overhead in doing the act of compressing and decompressing. And then it also reduces those backup and restore windows. Now, so for those of you who may think tape is dead, it is amazing to me how many customers still use tape. Maybe they're compressing to the drive and putting on that tape, but in the end, it still ends up somewhere. But that act of needing to do a backup and restore is still an overhead burden that storage optimization reduces for you. And then there's Warehouse Accelerator. I'm pretty sure most of us have seen or heard of this, but I want to take a slightly different spin on what it is because it isn't just about warehousing. In fact, I see some folks here on the webcast here who've actually done quite a bit with this. It's really about query acceleration because Warehouse Accelerator insinuates we're thinking this is only something for a traditional good old-fashioned machine that is doing, a star-based schema, and that's all it's doing. Where in reality, the Warehouse Accelerator is more of a query accelerator for what you need. So you get this performance gain that you just cannot get with traditional memory-based caching. You also have it where it is transparent to your application set. It is transparent. So whether you're doing something with Java, .NET, you have some old 4GL or, some older client-server tools that you're running against the database, or some combination of the 4 or 5 things you're doing, and it's very transactional in nature, it can still take advantage of the Warehouse Accelerator. So it is transparent because it's down to the optimizer where it figures out where it can take advantage of this in-memory component. And there's also tools that come along with it. So once you set it up, and in fact even comes with a tool that recommends what you put into memory, it will be very hands-free. So it doesn't add to your burden or your overhead to take advantage of this. And one of the things that kind of gets lost sometimes because IBM is a large machine. Large machine. I can tell you as an employee, it's a huge machine. This is organic IBM intellectual property from the Blink project. In fact, we just produced a video with the distinguished engineer who first came up with Blink. His name is Guy Lohman out of our labs in the Bay Area in San Francisco. And I'll make sure everybody gets a copy of where you can go get this video where he talks about the Blink project and what motivated them. And it really is about, this wave of hardware technology trends. And I am still of the age, and I'm not that old, but I guess I'm getting that old because I'm sure we all started doing computing when we were 12, and that's why as we were doing it over the years, we're not that old yet, is that if I think about multi-core processing, large main memories and fast interconnects, that's all great and good, but as I was describing earlier, there's still this increased, and I like the way, this is actually a slide right from Guy, the latency gap between memory and disk. In fact, I said to somebody a couple weeks ago when I was presenting, I made references to a Winchester drive, and he didn't know what I was talking about. I says, well, you know a hard drive? Yeah, that's a Winchester drive. Winchester drives will always be burdened by that mechanical act of that arm hitting that drive. So you are consistently seeing where It isn't just that multi-core processors are getting faster, main memory is getting faster, and the interconnects between machines are faster, but all three of those components are getting cheaper. So I think it's amazing whenever I go out to Dell.com, HP.com, IBM.com, and I look at hardware prices. And if you priced a box recently with a terabyte of RAM in it, I mean, I remember when a terabyte of RAM, I mean, it's like you were needing Seymour Cray to come in with his PhDs to talk about a terabyte of RAM. Or today, with two 8-core Xenons, you can put it on your credit card for $45,000 without any discounts. So what the Blink project and what the Warehouse Accelerator is doing is taking advantage of this price performance and not being burdened by the disk components. So, as I've also seen where some of the folks who are on this webcast today have also seen is, you know, when you work with the Warehouse Accelerator, it truly is the sum of these parts. And in fact, the sum of these parts was what the driving thesis was behind Guy and his team in doing the work and coming up with Blink. It is about compressing what's in memory. Now, when I say compression, it isn't the disk compression I was describing earlier. This is compressing what it's putting into that main memory. So as I have a box with 1 terabyte of RAM, I can put 5 terabytes of data in that memory segment. And by the way, the next box down, in fact, here, let me use this technology to my advantage, is there's no temp space, no indexes, no fragmentation, and in fact, my favorite techie term in the whole slide deck, nada. There's none of those things or overhead that you have in running the Warehouse Accelerator. So when I say you can put 5 terabytes of data in memory, I mean 5 terabytes of data. Because I would bet that for those of you out there who are doing some data warehousing with Informix or any other technology, whenever you talk about the size of your data warehouse, I'm betting it's about a third of it is really data, and the rest of it is temp space and indexes. So you can put probably a 15 terabyte data warehouse into this $45,000 machine and get unprecedented performance. But what's very different about this as well is because you have Informix, you have this row-based logging transactional system as a back-end component, you can still do your mixed workloads. This large court system, these 800 users against Informix, having to have a cut of that data to run, you know, some really unattractive SQL into that they showed me a print. They had one query that was a printout, 3 pages long, one query. Really unattractive queries, and accelerate those, you can have that mixed workload with Informix. You don't get that with these other warehousing technologies or even these other more columnar-based databases. It's also all in memory. In fact, the only reason let's call it a query accelerator just for simplicity's sake, the only reason the query accelerator uses any disk at all is that there's a certain point where we'll take a snapshot of what's in RAM, store it to the hard drive. If for some reason, you know, somebody comes along and unplugs the box, you plug it back in again, and it will pull off of that drive what was in memory so that you're up and running that much faster. And what's interesting about it as well, because I have, you know, visions of the 90s when the way we were scaling computing was with the clustering. And what's interesting about clustering is you could infinitely scale a database as long as you could just add more nodes to a cluster. And if, for those of you who've been around Informix a while, that's why technologies like XPS came out of Informix back in the 90s, is because people were out there buying, you know, 100 nodes or of an IBM SP machine, or for those of you who remember Sequent or the HP Superdomes, you would go buy a couple of those and interconnect them, and then you would create a cluster. This is doing the same thing inside that box. Each one of those cores is assigned its own memory segment, and it is shared nothing in that way. So that when it starts running that query and it starts processing how to get those results in that columnar in-memory component, you are actually taking that SMT component of that machine and breaking up the sharing nothing between the memory address and that core. What that means is as you add more cores, you actually do scale up linearly. So if you go from let's say an 8 to a 16-core box, it will take half the time because you are not having to worry about that sharing of resources inside that machine. Here's just some examples. This is one of my favorites. This is for those of you who have children my age. For those of you who don't know, I have 3 kids under 9. And there's a certain shoe brand out there that haunts me every day when they put them on called Skechers, especially the ones that blink, that have batteries in them. And Skechers has this need for a high number of users to run complex queries so that they can understand how to better sell more of these blinky shoes to my wife and kids. They had these set of queries running in Informix, and I think if you add all that up, it's almost 2 hours in that middle column. Without changing the queries at all, they ran them with the warehouse accelerator, and you add that up, and you get to about 16 seconds, 18 seconds. What's most important to realize, this isn't just for one person to run these sets of queries. This is for hundreds of people to run these queries concurrently. So it's about high concurrency, high throughput. Here's another of my favorite examples, and what I like about this is how they compare it with Informix with the warehouse accelerator, and then against a very large Teradata machine. And how even with the warehouse accelerator here in the middle column, you get some amazing performance out of not that expensive a box. In fact, I see here that you have a 24-core box with 144 gigs of RAM. That's about the price point I was quoting a couple of slides back. So it is not an expensive machine, allowing a lot of people to run very complex merchandising queries for a lot of employees, both within corporate and out in the stores themselves. So you start getting 48 seconds in Informix, 26 in Teradata, 1.8 with the warehouse accelerator. And then there's time series. So we talk about warehouse a little bit there, and then we talk about time series. And the reason I mention this is because the more customers I talk to, the more they, without even knowing it, are having a sensor problem. So this isn't just for smart sensor requirements. This also starts getting into things like fleet management. Now, fleet management sounds like something that J.B. Hunt Trucking or Warner Trucking, or the next time you're driving on the highway and you see a truck going by you and you see the name on the door, people like that, you think about fleet management. But there are communities in Colorado, for instance, where it is legislated that every vehicle that runs in that city, whether it's a police car, a fire truck, the dog catcher, has to have a GPS monitor on top of it feeding back to City Hall every 5 seconds the location and the speed of that vehicle. It is the single largest data explosion some of these cities have, period. And what is their solution right now? Oh, we'll load it into SQL Server or MySQL, but about every 2 weeks or 30 days have to archive it off somewhere. And they're not really enabling that data at all. They're just throwing it in there, and they're trying to figure out, how do we use this data? Well, that's where time series comes into play. And I highlight this example here where you do have a large utility who is rolling out a smart meter implementation. This is actually Encore in North Texas. And you think about North Texas, they have a lot of need for electricity there. And this is 15-minute read rates off of 1 million meters, and you get an idea of not just the performance in terms of loading it and querying it, but also, especially, the thing accountants love the most, the storage savings. I don't know about everyone on the phone here, but I would bet that whenever you go talk to your boss about, why Informix is better, and you're talking about speed is hard to quantify into money. But when you start talking about how we use 66% less storage, that quantifies into money. And I always love a good comparison. And I think I presented this in a presentation some here recently, and I'm not sure if you saw it, but to me, I'm of the school of thought that a real-world comparative benchmark that applies like technology to a specific business problem has a lot of credibility. Part of the problems with the old TPC benchmarks is they can be manipulated by everybody. The hardware vendor, the storage vendor, the database vendor. This is an example of a smart meter system called the Meter Data Management Solution. And within this meter data management solution, you have 3 primary things that you are doing. You're loading the data, you're running it through kind of a validation, editing, and estimation process, and then you're finally having to bill the customer for their electricity usage. Well, you look at the Informix column, and we ran 18 times more meters. In fact, I just saw a presentation by Gartner where they said there are 20 million meters, smart meters rolled out in the United States in total today. So now running 5 times more meters than exist in all of the United States today on one 16-core machine, and able to process those in, record time. And oh, by the way, even using 9 times less electricity to do it. So if I'm running something to figure out how to save power for my customers, I better make sure I try to save power just what I'm doing alone. And bear with me here as I have a little moment with my browser not responding to me. Here we go. So that's all, new is great. All these new things I showed you and some of these things that may not be so new that I wanted to highlight again are awesome. But what about getting me from where I am? So there is, the upgrading in place. And in fact, I had a customer recently do a 7.31 to 1170 upgrade in place without any problems whatsoever. But even from these other releases, 9.4 and above, your ability to migrate in place is, to me, one of the most valuable points of Informix. That migrate in place, compared to what I've heard over and over again about other technologies, is bar none something that has been one of the secret sauces of Informix. But then there's also changing hardware, because usually what motivates people to have to, upgrade Informix is the fact that they are finally getting a new machine to run it on. And there's all kinds of ways in which you can go on the migration guide and see how to do this. And this is something I must have conversations 4 or 5 times a quarter about. It is, how do I migrate? How do I minimize my downtime? How do I this? How do I that? And there's all kinds of ways to do it. In fact, some of them are good old-fashioned DB export, DB import, or some where you do a remote connect and you pull across, or for those of you who may not know this, and sometimes this works and sometimes it doesn't. So I'm not going to make any assurances here, is to be able to use, the enterprise replication to migrate from even 7.31 to 1170, which I think to me is one of the most interesting ways of migrating, because now you can have your new system be up to date with your old, so when you do the cutover, you minimize your down window. And then there's other clients where you may need to be more manual in how you run it. Maybe you do an export, you do a high-performance load on the other side. But I've also found that, the single largest challenge in migration isn't necessarily moving the data, it's the regression testing. It's the making sure the application doesn't break. And the 2 words I'll say to you right now as you're dealing with a migration like this is watch out for reserve words. 1170, all these new features, to me the single largest cost of these new features is there's now certain words now, certain, combination of letters that are now reserved by Informix that before 1170 they were not. So I want to make sure I highlight that as well, because that could be something that will come up and bite you if you do not watch out for it. And I think I just found out that my internet connection went down. So bear with me a moment as I find out why, and we'll get back online. As I'm getting back online, I believe the browser's still running, and hopefully you can still hear me. If anyone has any questions, please let me know through the browser-based tool. Okay, I think we're back up. So that is actually the end of my presentation, and if there's any questions, please let me know. Again, my apologies for the for the internet moment. So with that, I will call it an end of a presentation. So I do want to highlight, thank you